Hello, friends. So today I'm going to talk about the shifting landscape in independent media for content creators, podcasters, video creators, stuff like that. I don't know if you knew this, but in this past year, there's a podcaster, 2024, who let us know that he made $20 million. And he didn't do this through a network deal. He did this and not really anyway. And he didn't do it through traditional advertising either. He did this through direct listener subscriptions. And meanwhile, in my experience this year, I find that there are still a lot of indie creators, podcasters, and YouTubers and newsletter producers who are looking for and asking the question of how do I get picked up by a network? How do I get picked up and affiliated with an ad network? And at the same time, I find that many OGs seem to be lamenting the good old days of old school podcasting, and I suspect that love might be slightly misdirected, actually. The disconnect that I find between what's actually really and truly possible and what many indie creators think they should be chasing is what I want to talk about today. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen because I have a couple slides so that you don't have to look at me all of the time as we do this. So the big shift, I'm going to share with you my common sense disclaimer, which I use when I put stuff on YouTube. And I want to also explain that the reason I'm putting this out, it's going to sound probably like these are conclusions and that I feel that I am the person who should be teaching other people these things. It's actually kind of the opposite. I, like many indie creators, live in a silo or an information bubble where when I have thoughts and ideas, the only way that I have to introduce them is almost to put them out into the world. So this is one of my ways of starting the conversation. So I'm going to share some ideas that I have with you today. Some of them might be more or less controversial. Some you might not have thought of at all. Some might be information that you've seen and you already know. Some stuff you might really disagree with, and all of that is fine. I want to invite you into the conversation, connect with me, let me know what you think, all of those things. That's the reason I'm doing this. So let's start with my very, very first topic, my favorite topic, me. My name is Amy Stone. If you don't already know me, I am the creator behind a show which is called The Art of Imperfect Adulting. Right now, it is considered by Listen Notes to be a top 5 indie show. That's sometimes impressive, sometimes not. Um, I'm not an industry insider, and I'm also not a celebrity. I've never been on The Bachelor or anything like that. But because this is a project that I'm working on, because it's something that's very close to me, I pay at least pretty close attention to what I know about what's happening and what I'm experiencing as a content creator. And what I've been experiencing the past couple of years, and I'll say 2024 and 2025, doesn't match very well with what I see as industry coverage. And that's why I'm beginning to talk about that. So let me give you an example of what I mean. I would say that my show can be called a podcast. Sometimes, though, I don't know exactly what to call it. I release it simultaneously in audio through an RSS feed and also on the open media platform YouTube as video, as well as through a bunch of different directories. And also, there's a newsletter and a website, right? So I think that a lot of the words that we use to describe what we're doing these days in new media are in flux. And sometimes it doesn't match what we're actually doing. And this is just the vocabulary. For me, when it comes to podcast, that's a fight that people have like in communities online, like what makes a podcast. I would say call it whatever works for you. But at the same time, not using aligned words can be problematic. Same thing with the word creator, content creator. Does it mean somebody who's making short-term videos on TikTok? Does it mean somebody who's crafting with yarn? It's unclear, right? It's unclear. On my show, I interview people about transition points in their life. What makes my show a little bit different is that I like to talk to people about the decisions and choices they make, why we do the things we do. I love my show. It's fun, it's great, and all of those things. So, all right, before we get too deep into it, let me talk a little bit more about the concept of confusion in my mind. Maybe you will think that I'm just confused, and that's okay. Let me know. Historically, media was divided into very distinct silos based on how the format in which it was created and distributed. These could be newspapers, magazines, books, even television, radio, film, and each of those methods had their own creation systems, their own distribution systems, their own business models, their own set of rules, their own talent pools. And if you were a television creator, you might not need to understand book publishing. If you were a traditional print journalist, you maybe did not actually need to know how film distribution might have worked, right? Today, those rules I find to be very much blurred. A podcast episode becomes a YouTube video, becomes a newsletter article, becomes social media content, becomes a book chapter, and so on and so forth. So, from where I'm standing, most people I know are what I would call omni-channel creators, working across multiple formats and distribution channels simultaneously. And that's the experience that I have. But I don't see that reflected in many industry places. So, for example, earlier today, I was poking around on Muck Rack. They don't even have a category for a podcast yet. And I didn't see anything about YouTubers. So anyway, just to give that a thing. To give this an industry source, so you know that I'm not just making this stuff up, in October 2025, I listened to an interview from Kristen Nelson, who is with the Boston Globe. She's in the podcast section of the Boston Globe. And she mentioned, and she's referred to the fact that she finds it to be a lot of work to retrain people in the newsroom to think of every story they create in all the different media formats at the same time. And that was from a show called Podcast Perspectives, released on October 14th, 2025. I think that this is one reason that perhaps many creators feel overwhelmed today. It's not just enough to understand audio podcasting released on RSS. Success in terms of audience penetration and growth means really today that you need to understand a fuller ecosystem, how streaming works, what OTT means, and if you don't know what it means, I'm going to teach you in a second, how the different platforms connect and interact. And that is one of the things I want to talk about today. So I'm going to start with something that I think we can probably all agree on. Changing the slide. There I go. I think that everybody in all phases of this industry can probably agree with the fact that the rules of the entertainment and media business have changed. One of the things that people talk about, and when I talk about industry type back channel conversation, is that there's a lot of commentary about the industry of podcasting. And I think that should be a question, actually. Is podcasting its own industry? Because where I'm standing, I think the actual industry is media and entertainment. That's just my opinion, and people may not like the way I phrase that. But for me, that's the bigger industry, and the things underneath it are really formats and channels and distributions. And the reason I think that's an empowering reframe from thinking, oh, podcasting is its own industry, is that when you just say that podcasting is an industry, that's a lot of pressure to stay in that one channel. And if you zoom out and say, hey, the industry is media, performing arts, and entertainment, then it's more of a situation where it's like you said, these are the skills that we have that apply across a variety of different distribution channels and different things. Because I think it is omni-channel today, but that's just my opinion. Okay. So I think that we can agree that the industry has changed. People look to technology and tools right now a lot. When I'm seeing people talk about it, there's a lot of jibber jabber out there about analytics and creating new tools for effective analytics. There's a lot of stuff in the academic space and overall about immersive media and AI, wearable tech, stuff like that. And I think that truthfully, that all of that is fine and people can be interested in all of those things. But a more significant differentiator, in my opinion, is that the behavior of the audience has shifted. And I think that's important, right? I think that's important because that's what drives what we do, right? The audience is why we're here. So when I was a kid, I'm 52 as I record this at the end of 2025. When I was a kid, there were like some channels. There were like 3 in the Midwest and 11 on the coast, right? If you had cable, maybe you got 25 or 30 channels. If you wanted to watch something, you had to be there in front of your set in person. I have a very funny memory of watching TV with my grandmother in the Midwest, and she had a push button thing by her chair where she would use it to change the channel with her foot. It was a little cable, a little pneumatic pressure thing. She pressed on a little balloon, and it would change the channel. Funny. Anyway, this was pre-VCR when I was a kid. The people who created and delivered the news and entertainment on radio, TV, and film, they controlled completely when and what we consumed. And the vocabulary I would use for that is legacy media, right? That's what I would call that. So, and that was true for newspaper, that was true for book publishing, that was true for radio, that was true for TV. Today, I think we're living in a time where that model is no more, like totally gonzo. Like it's still there. All of that is still there. And many of the people who created that are still in control and still in power. You can watch broadcast TV, you can listen to AM, FM radio. The difference is that more people now stream media than they watch on any legacy network channel. This data point came out this summer from Nielsen, and Nielsen is the company that for a long time has handled broadcast and media statistics, and so that's the source. There are two dominant sources right now for delivery and promotion systems, right, for media and entertainment, as I see it, right. One is algorithmically driven. These are the suggestion engines. This is where consumers are being served or offered content. Most famous on the short form media on apps, but it's also there in other platforms like Netflix, where it suggests something that you might like. And the other, though, which is streaming, right, which is requested by the client, and they're making their choices from a library of choices. There's a lot of overlap here, you guys. And when I tried to talk to my husband, who's not in media or entertainment, about that, he was really unable to understand the differentiation that I was creating for him. And that is actually my point, because I don't think that the clients, the audience, has any idea what the difference between any of this is. And that's helpful for people who are creators to know. But when I think about this, I think about long ago when Steve Jobs from Apple was releasing the first iPod, and he was on stage and made a big presentation. He was like, "Hey, we're not going to use a stylus. We're going to use the stylus that we were born with, which is our finger." And this was really seen as being a really innovative positioning and technology. And it's significant because it was true. We did all have fingers and we did all want the iPod. So it's significant today because I think that what the difference there is, they really looked at what the humans were already doing, human behavior. That was an interesting time because that was the time of really, user interfaces were coming out and stuff like that. But they did a great job of matching their product to the way people were actually going to use it, instead of trying to train people to do something the way they wanted to do. And it is my opinion that sometimes we see rapid growth when we create something that matches the behavior that people are always doing. I'm not an expert on that. You can disagree with me and you can tell me I'm wrong, and I will defer. So one thing that I think is that the world of business and media are interconnected. I mean, media companies are businesses. In the indie creator space, I find a lot of people who talk about how they just want to be in a position to make their product and everything else should just happen on a whim, right? I just want to make my art. I do think that a lot of times this means that people are just a little bit fearful to put their vision and their dream out into the world, and I respect that. They are putting a public face of not having to claim that they want commercial success. I think that's just a thing that we see. If you're wondering how many conversations I've had about this, I have done 170 interviews for the show this year, and probably I'd have to look, but another 100 just connections with people who want to meet me and talk to me about this. And this is one of the things I ask them. One of the things that we've seen in the past few years, let's put this on a decade, right? This is not a new thing. The rise of the personal brand and solo creators who are out there promoting products directly to an online audience. Sometimes we call these groups, these people, influencers. A reason these two types of media personalities grew was in part because of that flywheel of suggestion growth that I was talking about. The algorithm was driving the social media platforms. And so this worked very well, right? Some people are beginning to say that it doesn't work as well as it used to. I think that probably algorithms actually work exactly the same way they always have worked. But I think that a couple of things have changed, right? First, the groundswell of new information that fueled the algorithms has shifted, right? So not everybody remembers this, but the way Google was populated was by boots on the ground people went out and found businesses and loaded that into Google. It wasn't just like that it picked it up by itself. And so we have been feeding off of that for a very long time. And I don't know that it works exactly the same way as it did. Same thing with Facebook. Facebook was populated by people going in and loading in directories from universities. All right. So anyway, the groundswell of new info that fueled the original algorithms on some very big platforms has been around for a long time, and it may have shifted. And truthfully, I think that some of the things is that the audience behavior has shifted to looking for entertainment and media through streaming channels. And streaming channels is one to one. I log in and I say, I want to watch insert your show. I want to watch Pluribus. I want to watch a football game. I want to watch, whatever you want to watch. I want to watch Friends. One of the interesting things about this whole streaming thing is that like never before, like you can watch a program that has been off the air for decades and you can still stream it like it was new, which is cool, very cool, but it is impacting the marketability and the lives of properties and entertainers and all of these things. It's a very interesting cycle to me, maybe not to you. Anyway, this desire of audiences currently, and I'm not an expert on this, but anyway, it's called lean back. People like to choose, the audience behavior is that people like to choose from a directory. And they like to turn on their television or open their phone and pick from a list of available options versus the doom scroll, which is where it's served to you within an app and you are just being fed what you like on the algorithm. So from a creator perspective, that creates a challenge because we want our stuff to be found. We want it to be searchable and we want it to be found. So a lot of times if people are out there trying to be caught by the algorithm, I think there's a different question out there to be asked, which is that really the best way to be, or is it getting yourself into the directory where people or the library where your potential audience is searching? Growth is the number one question and desire that I find from indie creators like me. I know this, or I think this because I see everybody asking, hey, how do I grow my show? How do I grow my audience in Facebook groups, in Substack, in Reddit communities, everywhere I go? How do I market my show for growth? How do I get monetization? How do I scale? These are really great questions. They're very important. And I do think it's fair to say that maybe when we get answers that are not working, that is partly because things have changed, right? So, and changes, in my opinion, change is a constant. So that's just my own two thoughts. I'm going to give you an example of the change today at the end of 2025, where right when I'm recording this, we were doing like college bowl games and so on and so forth, right? We're a couple months away from the Super Bowl. I think it's a great example, partly because the NFL is untouchable. I think this is an example of old guard thinking colliding with new audience behavior, right? People will do a lot to see their football games. They really will. For years, I bought a DirecTV package for NFL Sunday so that we could get the games. When you order a cable package, if you want the Comedy Channel, you have to it's always the biggest package, the most expensive thing to get the sports, live sports. But not too long ago, the NFL shifted the way they did this. It used to be that it was mostly one network and then like some splinters, right? But now they have spread this across a lot of streaming platforms, including those that you have to pay for, like Amazon Prime, but YouTube, which you don't, Peacock, ESPN. It's creating what some people are calling viewer fatigue, right? People have to subscribe to multiple services and they have to hunt for where the game lives on that day. So instead of being able to just turn on the channel and go to CBS to watch the Super Bowl, you might have to subscribe to another service. You could even go to a sports bar, and look for the game, and there could be a situation where they're not paying for that service, and so they're not streaming your game. And I think that this is old school thinking, right? Old school thinking. We control the premium content, so audiences will follow us wherever we put it. I'm going to say with NFL, I think that's probably accurate. But from other things, extend that out. Like if the audience behavior has changed, people want to browse a library on their preferred platform and choose what to watch. So are you going to pay for Apple if the show is on Apple and you don't have Apple? Or are you just going to stick with what's in Netflix, right? I think that audiences and people in audiences appreciate the suggestions when they're a good fit. You watch like a murder mystery and then it suggests another one. I think that's good. I don't know that people love chasing their content across, sorry, 5 or 6 or 10 or 11 different apps. I will say for football, they're doing it and they will probably continue to do that. But for an indie show that is really looking for growth and expansion, this is different. It might mean that is a really big thing you don't want to think about the idea that audiences are going to come to you only because it might not work. Not that it's a bad thing to think about. Think about it as much as you want. But instead, maybe the question is, how do I get into directories where the audience is already looking and how do I get, listed and cross-matched and type coded so that they can find me based on what I'm showing. This is places like YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Roku channels. These are libraries where people are already browsing, Amazon Prime Video. And the job then becomes making sure we show up there and not thinking that it's like we are a destination as an indie creator. If we build it, people will come. And I think there might really, truly be an issue for indie creators that there aren't as many directories as there should be, right? Netflix is Netflix, and the search engine is a black box system that they control. But if you want to go look for all redheaded people on YouTube, there's no way to find that. In fact, there's no way if I wanted to say, hey, where's a list of all women podcasters? I don't think that exists, right? And so is that a situation? I don't know. You tell me. All right, let's back up a little bit and talk about some of the vocabulary before we go too deep while you're thinking about that. Let's talk. I'm calling myself an indie creator. I am not the person who defines the vocabulary. I am also not the indie creator police. Some people use the word creator for making short form traffic on apps. Influencers on TikTok who are doing brand deals and affiliate deals and TikTok shop, right? That's actually not how I'm using it. It's not that that's wrong, but that's just not how I'm using it. I used this word the other day and somebody said you should probably be saying indie content creator because an indie creator could be somebody who's doing crafts, knitting and things like that. Also very possible. Again, one of the things I said earlier is I'm not sure the vocabulary that we use works as well as I wish it did. So what do I mean by an indie creator? I'm using this to describe somebody who is part of the creator economy, somebody who's creating things that they hope to put out into the world and earn either direct sales from something they're selling or affiliate pass-through revenue through things like that. Somebody who's not a celebrity, never been on The Bachelor. Not somebody who's been on a big show, right? So not somebody who's employed by a large studio or network or legacy broadcast or journalism company. Independent people or small teams creating things that we would call podcasts, video shows, interview shows, talk shows, newsletters, books, magazines, films, content where the small indie creator or team, they own and control the work start to finish, right? So why does this shift matter that I'm talking about for creators? It feels like, to me anyway, like we are experiencing a shift in how information moves around. And if you feel that, then I think that's because we are. And there are two places that I see this, how people are watching media and entertainment, and then also who's making the most money. All right. So I think I have another slide. Let's see what the next one is. Okay, yeah, here we go. So I mentioned this earlier, OTT, and I told you I was going to tell you what it meant. OTT stands for over the top, and it accounted for 44.8%. Oh, so this slide is wrong. So that says 48, but it's 44.8% of TV viewership. That's the highest share ever that was measured. Broadcast TV had 20.1% and cable had 24.1. So that puts them at 44.1. So they're very, very close, but 44.1 to 44.8 with OTT over the top being the bigger one. And OTT means that it's delivered, it stands for over the top. It means that it's delivered via a streaming app, right? I do think that this difference is not perceptible to most of the people who are doing it, but this is the difference between streaming Netflix on your smart TV or watching YouTube or your smart TV and watching ABC as delivered through an antenna signal, a cable signal. I do not know where ABC over the ABC. I don't know how that breaks down. That's where I lose my expertise. Not an insider. Totally. I'm willing to learn. I'd love to learn. Here's the thing, you guys. This to me is huge. This is like Gutenberg press big. Okay. I'm going to turn off my little slide so you can see how enthusiastic I am about this, right? Because this is massive. This is massive, massive, massive. If you don't get the reference to the Gutenberg press, let me just clarify kind of what I mean. Prior to the Gutenberg press, the only way to make something that was like a newspaper, a flyer, or a book was to have access to the tools and training and staff and people who knew how to create that thing. So that was either people who were highly trained in calligraphy that could handwrite and copy text onto paper and distribute it, or a team of people that would craft print blocks and press it into books. And the Gutenberg press made it possible. It was so that before the Gutenberg press, it was extremely expensive, very, very hard to do. And what that meant was that this was concentrated into a very small number of people around the globe who could do it. Right? The power to disseminate the printed word pre-Gutenberg press was controlled by a very, very small amount of people because it was really, really hard to do. And the Gutenberg press made it possible for a much smaller organization to print and publish press, papered goods, right? This, from that time forward, the person publishing the news, there's a much bigger group of people who controlled how much information went out. So it was going from a teeny tiny little itty bitty group to a much bigger group. And this seems like a dinosaur level, like seems like old school shift this long ago, but it was a really, really big deal. The Gutenberg Bible meant that it was standardized over. They were able to press more of them, and it was a really, really big deal. And I feel like we're seeing a shift like this again, right? Where we are shifting from a small group of people having the locus of control to a place where many, many, many more people have the ability to bring information out and distribute it to the world. We're seeing this in print, like through things like KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing, audio through the RSS platform and all of the things that make audio podcasting distribution possible, video through open platforms like YouTube and the vertical networks through the apps, even things like Amazon Prime Video, maybe even film, right? So you could call this self-publishing. Some people call it user-generated content when it's created in a specific way. This for me is an enormous shift. In 1988, I was in high school. If I had wanted to make a TV show, I would have had to take my concept. I would have had to know how to do it. I would have had to sell it to somebody who could produce it and sell it and make it and do all of those things and sign all the agreements and all the revenue sharing deals. Today in 2025, anybody can turn on a camera and post the video to an open platform in YouTube or TikTok and stream it around the world instantaneously. There's nothing in the way. Throughout history, this creator-publisher relationship has been about a bunch of things, right? But the big ones are content control and money, right? So one of the things that shifted that the press gets political, right? So Thomas Paine, who wrote the pamphlet called Common Sense, he needed Robert Bell's printing press in the 1770s to do that. And history tells us that they eventually fought over who owned the content and who got paid for that pamphlet. It's not a new fight. Not a new fight. That's my only thing. So today we're seeing a couple different models emerge. So the old model that I mentioned, it goes like pitch to the network. They create it. They control distribution, and they have a big power advantage over determining the rules of revenue and profit. In the indie model that we see today, anybody can produce, you handle your own distribution, you take all of the costs and everything like that. You build your own audience, and then you can keep control of everything you can create and whatever revenue you can scrabble together. There's a third one, which is coming up, which is something I'm going to talk about, which is a hybrid pay-to-play model. And this is a controversial thing that a lot of people talk about, specifically in podcasting and interview format shows, but other things. But there is a model where people are saying, hey, I've got this facility, I've got this tool, I've got this network. You can pay to be a part of this. You can get a variety of things that are there. And then some of them even have built-in audiences that they will distribute to you, and you get to keep all or a portion of the audience. But one of the things that all of these have in common today in 2025, moving quickly into 2026, is the creator, the indie creator, and the team of creators have a lot of choices. And I think that that's significant because for the past like 250 years, there was really only one choice. There was no other option. And so now today, you do have choices. This is not all great for creators because one of the things that did happen in the old model was that there was an obvious set path for this is how we do this. This is how you rise to success. This is where you go get a job. This is where you learn how to do this. This is the path forward. Talent growth, professional development. That's actually much harder to do now. That everything's so spread out across everything. So it's really there. It does cost money to create a podcast, even if you are distributing it for free on a free platform. You're investing resources. Maybe you could say that time, is one of those things. It costs money to create video. It costs money to create a book or a movie. And with indie content, most often, the creator is taking on all the cost and the risk of production. There are some ways where people will do crowdsourcing and fundraising to do some of those things. But this is why I think the number one question in creator forums is always, how do I grow this and how do I monetize? How do I make money? Because there is a direct cost, right? And so in this mix of things, content, distribution, and revenue, there's a built-in inherent question, which is who determines what's inside the content? And I would call that editorial and creative control, if you wanted to put words on it. So back to my little reference to the printing press, which I think is a super fun thing. This is one reason that this shift between having pre-Gutenberg press and post-Gutenberg press, more people had the tools then to make their own printed materials. And so if you look back at old news, similar to today, right? Once we democratized or made more people able to do those things, there was a lot of misinformation and inaccurate information, snake oil type ads, and also information that was out there. It was entirely possible for a press to publish something that was misleading or inaccurate and not be called out for it for a very long time. Very, very long time. There was very little, if any, oversight and control. But over time, at least where I live in the United States, we did put in a bunch of rules in place and guidelines for people who are publishers and networks and things like that. And that has been the way we rolled for a long time. Let me get back to the slides so that you don't have to look at my mug. Let's shift to the next one. I think the game has changed. 180 degrees is a turnaround, right? 360 brings you back to where you already were. With this shift where everybody can have a podcast or a YouTube channel or self-publish a book, it's possible. Anybody can do it. There's nothing in the way, right? In fact, you could release a feature film onto Amazon Video, and there's nothing stopping you, right? So, but there has become over the last, I don't know how long, 5, 10 years, a little bit of a caste system or a ranking system, right? Where some methods of publication might be seen as more prestigious and respected. Podcasting is the butt of a lot of jokes, right? Anybody can have a podcast. Not everybody should have a podcast. All kind of things like that. Sometimes it is much more highly regarded to have a book that is traditionally published through an old school publishing house like Simon and Schuster or Penguin and insert the name of an established publisher than to self-publish through Kindle Desktop Publishing. And it's more prestigious to sell your show to a network or have Wondery reach out or any of those things to say, hey, let's do this, than to pay to have a pilot made through a for-profit FAST studio, right? A pay-to-play studio. One of the drawbacks that I'll throw out there for reflection of the old school model where the authority and concentration of power was held with a very small group of people is that there was a byproduct where it did by its own nature restrict the content that came out. Everything had to go through the approval process. This had a side effect that in almost every case, it can be looked through a historic lens and seen that marginalized groups were often ignored and not represented. And that's just a statement based on history. So if you disagree with it, let me know. I think that's true. Earlier this year, I began to think that the ranking system of like, hey, traditional method is better was pretty significantly out of whack. And the first thing that I saw was that Forbes had begun to include streaming influencers in their list of paid celebrities. So Ford is a publication that is predominant, has shifted what they put in their publication overall, which has been a big change anyway. But they included streaming influencers in their list of paid celebrities. And what was notable about that was that some of the streamers were making as much as the Hollywood stars, sometimes more money, sometimes a lot more money. Not like a little bit more. Some of them were making a lot more, which was really interesting to me to see. It got some attention. And then I referenced this at the open of this story. There's a podcaster, his name is Joe Budden. He basically broke the internet when he released how much revenue he said he was making in his independent podcast. He shared that his revenue figures, which were generated almost entirely through direct listener subscriptions on Patreon. That's how he did it, not through traditional platforms or network deals. This is called the Joe Budden Network, and it averaged 1 million a month in Patreon revenue through about 70,000 paid subscribers, projecting $20 million in annual revenue, with more than 12 million coming solely from those subscriptions. He's not a perfect example for indie creators with no audience because he did have a big existing audience from, I think, a music career. But it is interesting and notable that he was intentional in creating his platform outside of the legacy system. And he's talked a lot about the fact that I think, if my memory serves, he actually had an offer for a network deal and he turned it down and chose to build it his way. And I think that's interesting enough to pay attention. And he showed up with receipts to show what he's doing. He just didn't make a broad claim and not back it up. He showed up with receipts because I got to admit, the information and data on some of these things is really, really not always reliable. I was looking at somebody the other day on LinkedIn and they said they had 100,000 downloads a month on their podcast. I couldn't even find any record of them anywhere. They had like 17 YouTube subscribers. I don't know if it was true or not. So sometimes this stuff can be confusing. If we agree that the old methods, though, of media have shifted and the revenue methods have also shifted, then is it time to take a look at what's actually happening now? I think it might be. I think it might be. In one of the most surprising discoveries I made this year, I learned about a whole new type of video channel or network, right? So I knew about the way I watched TV as a kid. I knew about the apps that I was streaming on, and I knew about how I was distributing my own content through audio, podcast, and podcast players. And I was approached by things that didn't make any sense to me. And at first, I thought it was just the vocabulary. But then I had these conversations that I realized that there was this whole new part of video distribution that I was unaware of, even though in some of them I was already participating as a viewer, but I was just unaware, right? So I put my show out through YouTube, which is a part of this ecosystem. We call that an open platform, right? But I'm going to tell you about the others that I discovered and give you a little bit of vocabulary and jargon in case you didn't know it about these new media things. For audio podcasts, right, which is a thing that nobody who's not a podcaster knows, understands, or cares about. Audio on a podcast is distributed through the RSS feed and delivered by a podcast player, which you play with through an app on your phone or a smart player. The biggest players in the ecosystem are still Apple Podcasts and Spotify. YouTube also is a distributor, Amazon Music, things like that. When we looked at video, video is a much bigger industry. It has been since the invention of television. I don't think that's a controversial statement. It's a much bigger industry. It's a much bigger market. It's also the newest place where indie creators have tools en masse in a big group to create and distribute. And that's a shift, right? That's a shift. Just like when silent films were overtaken by the talkies, this is a shift, right? Since the beginning of media as a business, this change was not determined by the people who made the technology. It's driven by when the audience is choosing something new. And this is an example to me of a place where I see the disconnected industry conversations from what actually matters, right? In podcasting forums, you'll see a discussion pop up pretty frequently. Hey, what are the rules? Can a podcast have video? And people will fight about it. Seriously, hundreds of people. There's think pieces written about it. Industry newsletters are writing about it. Go to any podcast conference in 2025, 2026, and you'll find people talking about, the shift to video and podcasts and arguing about definitions and semantics. Meanwhile, I don't think anybody in the audience cares what you call it. Or what it is. They're searching for content on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. They're finding what they want and they're consuming it however it's delivered easiest to them, right? So in the 80s, Oprah Winfrey had the Oprah Winfrey Show on television. She has relaunched this on YouTube and she's calling it the Oprah Podcast. It's a talk show. It's on YouTube. It's also distributed in audio. I don't know that has any rules about this, but the fact that the debate is there and that people are fighting about it, that to me captures what might be a problem. Industry leaders, people who are in the industry, broadcasting, television, film, podcasting, whatever, they are focused on categorizing and defining and counting the data, while the audiences are simply making their decisions about what to watch or listening from the libraries that are in front of them. And so it's like, where do you want to be in this discussion? As a creator, do you want to waste time worrying about whether or not your show is a real podcast? Or does the more important thing, am I creating something that anybody wants to consume? And is my content discoverable and deliverable where people are looking for content? Right. All right. So now we're going to look at the jargon. I've referenced a couple of these things as we went. So some of this is a repeat. Streaming media is called OTT. That stands for over the top. It's using an app and the internet. My research, which was Googling and using my friends Perplexity and Claude. So call me in if I get some of this wrong, right? They break this down into two groups: open platforms, which is YouTube and Twitch. Twitch opens up a whole game of like Pandora's box because nothing I have talked about so far was at all including the very, very enormous section of online gaming and the content that's driven from that. That is a huge place that gets just sidelined and ignored by most people, but it shouldn't because it's a big thing. All right, so then we've got streaming video on demand, which is SVOD. They split that into two different categories: ad supported and free ad supported. So one of those you're paying for and one you're not because it has ads. And then there's also paid subscription by the consumer and digital pay for live television. Listen, this is a little confusing to me. I think a lot of these might overlap. But the thing that caught my eye, as I mentioned earlier about this, is that the streaming video surpassed traditional channels before. And as I've mentioned, I think at least twice, what I think the important thing that's wild about this is that from the point of view or perspective of the audience, they're just watching TV or listening to audio. They're not differentiating whether that's radio, whether it's audio pulled from a video, whether it's broadcast or where it's coming from, right? Whether they're watching it on a smart TV or a smart player or an app on their phone. To the audience, they're not paying any attention to any of this jargon. So one of the significant differences with this new method in new media is that each of these apps, and which you could think of as a network, they have their own independent library or inventory of shows, right? So the audience selects what to stream from that directory. And in some situations, creators can put themselves into that directory. So a creator can launch video directly into Roku as a channel and also through Amazon Video, right? That's a really big change. The only way to get into the old school NBC television lineup or onto Nickelodeon was to be picked up by their corporate group, to be created by that network. But today, if you want to pay for it, you can put yourself in that directory. As I've been trying to learn and understand the differentiation between all of these things, I learned that one of the differentiators that people are using for this is professionally produced versus what is UGC, which is user generated content. I think that what I produce is probably considered user generated content. At first, when I came across this distinction, I got to tell you, I was a little bit offended because I was like, wait a minute. I think that user generated content can be very professional. I really do, right? Are you going to go out there and tell Mr. Beast that he's not professional? You go right ahead because I'm not going to have that conversation. But I paused because I really do think that there is a difference, right? I know that I'm not NPR. And the content that is professionally produced is going to have a much different licensing and distribution agreement attached to it, along with relationships with who's in the show, how they're getting paid, syndication deals, all of those kind of things. So there is a difference. There is a difference. I'm not going to pretend that I completely understand it, but I'm no longer taking it personally. There's something that I want to talk about regarding the good old days that people talk about, right? People will be like, well, back in the day, it was better when podcasting just took off and the golden days of television. Nostalgia, right? Nostalgia. When they didn't actually exist, in my opinion, in my understanding, because of higher standards across the board or a stronger moral fiber in society. They existed simply as a side effect of the fact that only a handful of people had access to the tools that were releasing information, right? So at one point, Walter Cronkite had the title of the most trusted man in America. The New York Times, their byline was all the news that's fit to print. This was not something that was bestowed upon them based on countrywide surveys, right? Part of this is that there was very little to choose from. I mean, Walter Cronkite, when he was on TV, there were only three news networks to choose from. They just said it and went with it, right? So I talked about how the fact that there was like a period of time where it was like the wild, wild west, totally unregulated in print news and print content and print information that was out. A lot of misinformation, a lot of yellow journalism, all of those things, and regulations popped up to control things, right? So this was editorial standards, this FCC regulations. All of that worked, you guys, because the distribution was centralized and could be controlled by a homogenous group of people. If you wanted to have a radio station, or a television broadcast station over the antenna, you needed a license. And that gave regulators a place to gather the information and it gave them leverage to control people. But today, there's a lot less places of centralized distribution to regulate. RSS feeds do not need FCC approval. YouTube does not have a broadcast license. If you ask your smart TV to find a program, it is to some degree successfully checking all of the libraries, including the Roku channels, along with what is sent to you by NBC. And in my opinion, as somebody who doesn't have a lot of credibility, but I'm just going to say it, I think the genie's out of the bottle here. I don't know how you put this back in, right? I don't see how this goes back. But so when people say that we need to go bring back these standards, and sometimes often they're talking about with advertising standards and equal time for opposing opinions and content for the public good, those are things that are in broadcast licenses. I don't think it's that easy. Not because we're divided as a people on politics or a lack of morality, but simply because there's no choke point for anybody can go in and enforce these things anymore. And as I was working on my presentation, I was bouncing this back and forth with my little AI helpers to try and make this a clear presentation. Claude, who is my writing partner, he did not understand. I should give it a girl's name, but I don't. He did not understand why this FCC thing belonged in this presentation about indie creators. But just a couple weeks ago, I got a newsletter in my inbox from an industry insider newsletter about podcasting and broadcasting. And they were talking about navigating the future of broadcasting, actually. I wonder if I put the name of the newsletter. I don't remember. But so they were talking about, for them, declining earnings and how legacy media executives think that there should be regulatory action to change things. Right. That's what I'm talking about. Like, go back to the old times. But then there were other people who were media insiders who were saying, we're not so sure. And here's a quote to back this up. Here's a quote from Gray Media CEO Hilton Howell, right? It acknowledges the unprecedented ambiguity facing broadcasters. He notes that, quote, for the first time in the history of our business, we are really operating in the wild, wild west. No one knows what the rules actually are. You may not know who Gray Media is. I had to Google them to find out who they are. They're the third largest TV operator in the United States. So that's a big group, right? And they are saying they don't know what the rules are anymore. Another example is that just in the last decade, there are rules on the books that you are supposed to declare when you are promoting a product in a piece of content, and specifically affiliates in written content. You're supposed to put that disclaimer. It's like, hey, there are affiliate links in this document. Listen, do you see that on TikTok? Because I don't. I don't. Like people are just putting product placement in there, no disclaimer. Figure it out for yourself, right? I think this is helpful for creators to understand. We are not operating in some, deregulated version of the old system. I think this is a completely different system where those rules didn't apply in the first place. And as a creator, if you are existing in this new space but trying to follow the old rules, you might find yourself facing a lot of resistance. So let me be a little more clear about what I think this might look like from the indie creator point of view. If you're making content and thinking that what you need to happen is you need an agency or a network or a group come and discover you and find it and promote it for you and sell advertising for you and give you a paycheck and a syndication deal, I don't know how many people are out there doing that anymore. I think that there's a lot more people who are finding that the job of deciding whether or not it's good enough to get made falls to the creator. And that means that in that scenario, so does building the audience and building the revenue. And is that a good thing? The jury will tell us in the future. We're not there yet, right? I talked to a woman this year as an example of a network, me discovering a network that I didn't know existed. One of the interviews I did this year on my show was a woman who said she won a reality TV show. I'm not questioning those words, right? But the show is actually only distributed on Facebook these days. There are 18 seasons of the show. It's called The Blocks. The first season was distributed through Amazon, but now it's just on Facebook. So another conversation that I had that showed me that I was like, wow, this is something new that I'm totally not sure about. I was invited through a direct message to have a conversation to make a talk show pilot that would be distributed to 600,000 people, right? Probably this person found me because there was a clip of my interview show somewhere and they're like, this person would like to have a talk show. Good research, right? They had this pitch that was had a lot of stuff in it, 600,000 people, audience size, awards, all of these things. But I couldn't find this show anywhere. And I was thinking, how could I not know where this is? They were a stranger. I tried to look them up. I tried to find their show that they said was award winning, couldn't find anything. Turns out this is a private company that has a recording studio. You can pay them for their course or their services. They will help you make their pilot, and then they distribute it through their channel on Roku. I did not realize that people were doing that. I also go to a networking meeting, which is through a group called She Rises Studio, and they are a similar organization. They're actually a for-profit publishing company, and you can join them and pay for a variety of things to be published on their platform, right? This is semi-controversial. Some people think that this shouldn't be happening. I'm not the person who gets to decide that, and I don't have that opinion. That's not the opinion that I have. I think that there's always been a portion of broadcast and media that was pay to play. I don't know how this is going to shake out in the future. I don't think anybody knows. I don't think anybody ever knows the future. One of the challenges of being an indie creator or a creator of any kind is building your own audience. You don't have the amplification of reach that comes from being affiliated with a larger group. And another way that I'm thinking about this is that it's an inversion of the revenue model that used to exist for creators. The old day, you had an idea, and maybe you had a reputation and a resume that backed up that you could do that, an established spot in the industry, right? You would take your idea, you would pitch it, you would sell your script, you would do those things, you would get in the meeting with the person who could make it for you. Then that studio, that network, that group, that collection, the production house, they would take on the cost of producing your idea, distributing it, and then you had a contract that determined how future revenue syndication, any of those things might get. In the pay-to-play model, the creator is paying a fee for the cost of the production, and you get a set amount of access to the audience of the network, but all of that is negotiable because it's a for-profit model and up for negotiation. Bringing this back, what it means to me, I haven't done one of those things yet. Bringing that back to me, what it means for me, I think you can think of it as an empowering shift. Some of that might be a mental or a mindset shift away from chasing old legacy systems or chasing an algorithm and thinking about it instead about building your own media platform or channel that clients will discover. Then when they find it, they can request it directly. And for the first time, maybe really in some portion of history, individual creators have the same distribution channels and access as major studios. So then the question is not, will someone pick me? And also, it's probably not, can I get the algorithm to catch me? And the question becomes, what am I building? Who am I building it for? What is the library or directory where I want my show and content to appear? And I think this is what makes this very hard to navigate. Historically, creators specialized, artists, creators, journalists. You were a radio broadcaster, you were a podcaster, you made videos, you were a video editor, you were a writer who wrote books, and you worked with an agent and a publishing community. Communities and networks were organized in that way, and it made sense. When I was a working photographer, I was a member of a network professional photographer association. My father, who worked in live television, he was a member of a guild, right? That was how we grouped together. Today's indie creators, in my opinion, are omnichannel by necessity. We are creating on a bunch of different channels, a bunch of different medium, and distributing in a lot of different ways. Audio, video, written content, social clips, all the things. And so a successful indie creator needs to understand RSS feeds, YouTube algorithms, newsletter platforms, and streaming distribution. But, I forgot to change the slide, kids. Here we go. The industry communities that I find are still very siloed. To be honest, I'm going to say there aren't as many communities as there should be. It's something that I've been working on a lot, trying to find communities where I fit. I feel like it's harder than it should be, and I've joined a bunch. But they are still really siloed. There are some podcasting groups. There are some YouTube circles. There are writing communities. I think that specifically book communities, you see a lot of very functional, good groups. There are speaking communities which overlap directly with podcasting and YouTube communities. I have not found like sort of a general creator type community. There are business communities where there are subsets of podcasters and newsletters, or maybe you'll be the only podcaster in a big business group. And there are industry groups where service providers outnumber creators, right? So, or matchmaking platforms, which are guesting platforms, where guests outnumber hosts like a lot to one. There are so many more people who want to be guests on shows than people who create shows. So I do think that, and I'm going to go to, do I have more slides? What's this? What's this? That is one of my favorite quotes, but that is something that, all right. So I think there's a missing space. What is that missing space, Amy? Thanks for asking. Good question. Peer-to-peer support for creators. I think that there's a really, really, really big missing gap here. I happen to be a woman. I show up in the world as a woman. And so I'm actually talking specifically about female creators, people who show up as women in the world, creating across the entire landscape, not just one corner of it, right? Because one of the things that's happening to me is I don't feel like I fit perfectly into the podcasting group or the YouTube group or the newsletter group because I do all of those things. Omnichannel, right? So I didn't have any information to sort of talk about the women-sided aspect of this until recently. But USC Graduate School, they did some research and they released it in October. They are looking at what they're calling inequity in podcasting. This one data point stood out to me. Interview programs with female hosts had 45% female guests. Female hosts, 45% female guests. Not even the majority, ladies. Shows with male hosts had 17% female guests. So the loser there is women who want to be guests on shows. And significantly, it's not just that men aren't making, space for women, but women are putting more men on their shows also. So there's that. Notably for the USC thing, what the group that they looked at was the top shows, because the ranking for podcast shows and also in YouTube is the top of the top. And so if you have 3 million podcasts and there's the categories, you only can ever find the top 50 or 100 ranked by different people. And the rankings never line up. So you've got Spotify rankings, you've got Apple rankings, you've got Listen Note rankings, you've got YouTube rankings. They never align. They don't match up. That's the nature of the beast. But we only ever have that very, very top group. And one of the reasons that is a red herring or a false flag for indie creators is that when I look at those top lists, those are all network shows. Those are corporate shows put together by broadcast organizations. So in the top 10 podcasts on Apple, you're going to have shows from BBC, New York Times, NPR. That's who's in there. Mel Robbins, Jay Shetty, Oprah, um, all people like that, celebrities. That's who's there. And indie creators are down, way, 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 way down. But we don't have anybody looking at that. Like we don't know because that list is not, or at least I don't know where to find it. If you do, please let me know. I did actually reach out to a group which is called Raphonic that has a podcast database system that they scrape from open documents, open stuff, open source stuff that's out there. And I said, hey, is it possible to get a list of all the podcasts that were hosted or produced by women? And they were like, no, we don't have that data. They're just like, no, they don't have that data. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because it's one of the reasons we don't ask is so that you can't be oppressed on entry. So there's nothing in the way of people. It's anybody can put people out, but the downside is there's no set list. If you have watched all of this, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Leave me a comment. Send me an email. I'm impressed because this is long. But if you are a person who shows up in the world as a woman, right, and you create something in audio, video, film, words, photography, any of those things, I want to invite you to connect with me and hang out with me. And hopefully, maybe could be other women like us, right? I've set aside, I'm recording this at the end, in the beginning of December 2025. And I've set, so if you watch this in the future, it may not be happening. But anyway, I've set aside an hour of my week to meet with people who are in the same spot and looking for a group of creatives that they would like to hang out with. I call this unmuted. It's not really a word. It's totally inspired by that modern phenomenon in a Zoom room where somebody has their microphone off and everybody else is like, you're unmuted. You need to unmute yourself. Anyway, so on and so forth. If that sounds like something you would be interested in, I would love to hear from you. I have put my initial ideas of what I think is significant about putting a group together like this and how I think, from my perspective, it could possibly be helpful onto a web page at imperfectadulting.com/unmuted. But I also just want to say that I have a really open mind for the fact that, other than the fact that I think that this would be great to have a peer-to-peer organization, I don't have a preconceived notion of what it's going to be. And most importantly, I just want to say that at this point, at the time that I'm recording this, there's not a secret sales pitch for me to teach you how to make a YouTube video or a podcast. I don't do that. I'm a creator with my own show, building my own thing. And maybe someday there'll be a piece of my business where I do that, but today I don't. So don't feel like I'm going to try and sell you that by doing that. So you can go there. Put a link. This video is only going to go on YouTube, not on the audio channel, but I'll put this, so I'll put the link in the description and you can find me there. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Amy Stone, signing off.